I shouldered my rifle and did one last check of my gear, making sure everything was secure before heading down to meet my client. 40 years of guiding hunters through Alaska's backcountry had taught me to read people fast, and I could spot trouble from a mile away. Casey Howell was trouble. The guy came strutting down the Ketchikan Pier like he owned the place, decked out in hunting clothes so new they still had store creases. His rifle caught the morning sun. Some fancy custom job with more modifications than a NASCAR engine. Everything about him screamed money and zero experience. "You must be Harold," he said, sticking out a soft hand that had never held anything rougher than a golf club. "Ready to bag me a monster brown bear?" I shook his hand and nodded toward the boat. "We'll see what the island gives us. Weather's looking questionable." Casey laughed and slapped my shoulder like we were old buddies. "Come on, man. I've taken down bigger game than anything Alaska's got. You should see the trophy room at my place in Seattle." While I loaded our supplies, Casey kept running his mouth about some guided hunt in Texas, where he'd shot a captive bear from a tree stand. The whole time he's talking, I'm watching him struggle to lift his oversized pack, watching him check his phone every 30 seconds like he's expecting the stock market to crash while we're gone. "Listen," I said as we pulled away from the dock. "Coastal browns aren't like those ranch animals you hunted down south. These bears are wild, unpredictable, and they can weigh over 1,000 pounds. We need to—" "Harold, Harold." Casey waved me off and cracked open a beer. "I appreciate the safety speech, but I didn't pay premium rates to hear about how dangerous everything is. I want the real Alaska experience." I bit back what I wanted to say and focused on navigating through the choppy water. Storm clouds were building on the horizon, moving faster than they should for this time of year. The radio crackled with chatter from other guides, and what I heard made me frown. Bears abandoning their usual feeding areas, unusual tracks found near remote camps. Even the old-timers sounded confused. Casey spent the boat ride drinking and scrolling through his phone, completely missing the way the weather was shifting around us. The wind picked up, carrying a smell I couldn't place, something earthy and old that made me think of deep caves and rotting leaves. When we reached the inlet where I'd planned to make camp, even the seabirds seemed agitated. Gulls and ravens circled overhead, their calls harsh and discordant as they bounced off the dark water. In all my years coming to this spot, I'd never heard them sound like that. I secured the boat while Casey fumbled with his gear, cursing as his expensive pack caught on everything. The forest stretched ahead of us, massive spruce and hemlock trees disappearing into the mist that clung to the mountainsides. I'd been hunting these woods since I was 16, knew every trail and creek and ridge. But today, something felt off. The trees seemed to press closer than usual, their shadows darker despite the overcast sky. The normal sounds of the forest, chattering squirrels, singing birds, buzzing insects, were muted, like someone had turned down the volume on the whole wilderness. "This is it?" Casey looked around the inlet with obvious disappointment. "Looks pretty tame to me." I adjusted my pack straps and checked my rifle one more time. "The real hunting starts once we get inland. We'll hike about 5 miles to where the salmon runs attract the big males." Casey nodded and hefted his pack with a grunt. "Lead the way, guide man. Time to show me what Alaska's really made of." I started up the game trail that led into the forest, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us from the tree line. The woods felt different today, not just quiet, but expectant, like they were waiting for something to happen. After 40 years in these mountains, I'd learned to trust my instincts. And right now, every instinct I had was telling me we should turn around and head back to town. But Casey was already crashing through the underbrush behind me, talking loudly about his business deals and trophy collections, his voice carrying through the silent forest in a way that made me wince. I kept walking deeper into the trees, telling myself it was just pre-hunt nerves, but the feeling of being watched never went away. I knelt beside the creek and studied the tracks, running my fingers along the edge of the massive print. 40 years in these woods, and I'd seen plenty of brown bear sign, but this was different. The paw measured nearly a foot long, which meant we were looking at a monster, probably pushing 1,200 pounds. "How fresh are they?" Casey asked, fumbling with his rifle scope for the third time in 10 minutes. 6 hours, maybe less. I stood up and brushed the mud off my hands. Big male, moving fast. Casey grinned and slapped me on the back. "Perfect. Lead the way, guide man." But something was off about the stride pattern. The bear had been running, not the usual lumbering pace you'd expect from an animal that size, and the depth of the print suggested panic, like something had spooked it bad enough to send it crashing through the underbrush at full speed. I shouldered my pack and started following the trail upstream. The tracks were easy to read in the soft ground along the creek bank, each print telling the story of an animal in serious distress. Behind me, Casey kept up a steady stream of chatter about his Seattle real estate deals, his voice bouncing off the trees in a way that made my teeth itch. "You know what my biggest flip was last year?" he said, breathing hard as we climbed over a fallen log. $2.7 million on a waterfront property in Bellevue. Bought it for nothing, added some high-end finishes, boom. "Keep your voice down," I said. "Sound carries in these woods." Casey laughed. "What, you think the bears are listening to my business stories?" I didn't answer. The forest around us had gone dead quiet about a mile back, and that wasn't normal. No bird songs, no squirrel chatter. Even the mosquitoes had disappeared. In 4 decades of guiding, I'd learned that when the woods go silent, there's usually a good reason. We followed the creek for another hour, the bear tracks staying consistent along the muddy bank. Casey struggled with his oversized pack, cursing every time it caught on a branch, completely oblivious to the unnatural stillness pressing in around us. His expensive boots squelched in the mud, and he kept stopping to check his phone like he expected to find cell service in the middle of nowhere. "How much further?" he asked, wiping sweat from his forehead. "This pack weighs a ton." "We'll follow these tracks until we find where he's feeding," I said. "Could be another couple miles." The trail curved away from the creek and headed up a steep slope covered in devil's club and salmonberry bushes. I pushed through the thick vegetation, following the clear path the bear had bulldozed through the undergrowth. The tracks were getting fresher, and I could smell the musky scent that meant we were getting close. Then I stopped. The tracks had changed. I knelt down and stared at the muddy ground, my pulse picking up as I tried to make sense of what I was seeing. The clear bear paw prints from the creek had stretched out, elongated into something that looked almost human, but completely wrong. The claw marks were too long, spaced too wide, and there were extra toe impressions that didn't belong to any animal I'd ever tracked. "What's the holdup?" Casey pushed past me, his rifle barrel swinging dangerously close to my head. "We losing the trail?" I stood up slowly, studying the strange impressions in the soft earth. Whatever had made these tracks was walking upright now, leaving deep footprints that were bleeding into the mud. Dark stains surrounded each print, too dark and thick to be water. "Harold?" Casey's voice had lost some of its cocky edge. "What are you looking at?" I followed the new tracks with my eyes, watching them disappear into the dense forest ahead. The bleeding footprints continued in a straight line, accompanied by broken branches and disturbed vegetation that suggested something large moving with purpose through the trees. "These aren't bear tracks anymore," I said quietly. Casey laughed, but it sounded forced. What do you mean? What else would they be? I didn't answer. I was thinking about the stories my father used to tell, old Tlingit legends about things that lived in the deepest parts of the forest. Stories I'd always dismissed as superstition, meant to keep kids from wandering too far from camp. The tracks led deeper into the woods, where the massive spruce and hemlock trees grew so thick that sunlight barely reached the ground. Each footprint was surrounded by that dark staining, and I realized with growing unease that whatever we were following was hurt badly. "We should head back," I said. Casey stared at me like I'd suggested we give up and go home. "Are you kidding? We just found the trail. This is what I paid for. The real Alaska experience." He started walking toward the tree line, following the bloody tracks without any idea what he was getting into. I watched him crash through the underbrush, his expensive gear catching on every branch, his voice carrying through the silent forest as he called back to me. "Come on, Harold. Don't tell me you're getting spooked by some weird footprints." I looked at the tracks one more time, noting how the blood seemed fresh, still wet in the afternoon air. Every instinct I developed over 40 years in these mountains was screaming at me to turn around and get back to the boat. But Casey was already disappearing into the dark trees ahead, and I couldn't let a client wander off alone in country like this. I checked my rifle and followed him into the forest, the bloody tracks leading us deeper into shadows that seemed to swallow sound and light. The feeling of being watched settled over me like a weight, and I couldn't shake the sense that we weren't tracking something anymore. We were being led. I followed the bloody tracks deeper into the forest, where the massive spruce and hemlock grew so thick their branches wove together overhead like a ceiling. Down here, the air felt different, heavier, older, like breathing inside a cave that hadn't seen sunlight in decades. Casey kept running his mouth behind me, something about his stock portfolio and how his hunting lodge in Montana had better accommodations than this wilderness camping bullshit. His voice bounced off the trees in a way that made my skin crawl, but I was too focused on the tracks to tell him to shut up again. The bloody footprints were getting fresher. Whatever we were following had slowed down, the stride shortening from the panicked run we'd been tracking for the past hour. The dark stains around each print looked wet, almost black in the filtered light that barely made it through the canopy. "You know what my biggest mistake was last quarter?" Casey said, breathing hard as he stumbled over a fallen branch. "Not buying more Amazon when it dipped in March. Could have made another $500,000 easy." I stopped walking and held up my hand. "Listen." Casey crashed into me from behind, his rifle barrel jabbing into my shoulder blade. "What? I don't hear anything." That was the problem. The forest had gone completely dead. No wind in the branches, no bird calls, not even the buzz of mosquitoes that should have been eating us alive in this humidity. Just our breathing and Casey's expensive boots squelching in the mud. The tracks curved around a massive cedar trunk, and I followed them carefully, my rifle ready. Casey kept talking about real estate deals and trophy rooms, completely missing the fact that we weren't in normal woods anymore. This felt like a place where normal rules didn't apply. Then the trees opened up. I stopped so fast that Casey walked right into me again, cursing as his pack caught on my shoulder strap. In front of us sat a log cabin, its walls weathered to the color of old bones, windows dark and empty. The structure looked like it had been there for 50 years, maybe more, but I'd been hunting this area since I was 16 and had never seen any building marked on the maps. "What the hell?" Casey pushed past me, staring at the cabin. "You didn't tell me there was a hunting lodge out here." The bloody tracks led straight to the front door, which hung open about 6 inches on rusted hinges. A thick, sweet smell drifted from the dark interior, something that made me think of roadkill left too long in summer heat. "This isn't on any of my charts," I said quietly. Casey laughed and adjusted his pack straps. "Come on, Harold. You've been guiding for 40 years and you don't know about every old trapper cabin in the woods. Maybe we can spend the night here instead of camping." I moved closer to the cabin, noting the complete silence that pressed in around the clearing. The smell got stronger with each step. Decay mixed with something else I couldn't place, something that reminded me of wet earth and old blood. Casey walked right up to the door and shoved it open with his rifle barrel. "Hello? Anybody home?" The door swung wide, and Casey immediately stumbled backward, his face going white. "Oh fuck. Oh Jesus Christ." I stepped up beside him and looked inside. A man's body lay sprawled across the cabin floor, arms spread wide, face turned toward the ceiling. The corpse had been there for weeks, maybe longer, the flesh bloated and dark with decay. But what made my stomach clench wasn't the condition of the body. It was the symbols carved deep into the dead man's chest and arms, deliberate cuts that formed patterns I didn't recognize, like some kind of ritual marking. "We need to get out of here," Casey said, backing away from the door. "Right now." I forced myself to look closer. Weird totems hung from the ceiling beams, animal bones and feathers tied together with what looked like sinew. All the windows had been boarded up from the inside, thick planks nailed across the glass like whoever lived here had been trying to keep something out, or keep something in. The sweet stench rolled out of the cabin in waves, making my eyes water. I noticed dark stains on the wooden floor around the body, stains that looked too fresh for how long the man had been dead. "Harold." Casey's voice cracked. "We're leaving. Now." I checked my watch and felt my stomach drop. The sun was already touching the treetops, and we were at least 5 miles from our camp. In this thick forest, full darkness would hit us in less than an hour, and trying to navigate these trails in the dark was a good way to break an ankle or walk off a cliff. "We can't make it back to camp before nightfall," I said. Casey stared at me like I'd lost my mind. "I'm not spending the night here with that thing." I looked at the cabin again, noting the solid log construction and the heavy door. The windows were already boarded up, and the walls looked thick enough to keep out anything short of a grizzly with serious motivation. "We pull the body outside and clean up what we can," I said. "It's shelter, and we need shelter." Casey shook his head frantically. "No way. No fucking way." But the light was fading fast, and the forest around us felt like it was watching, waiting for darkness to fall. I'd spent 40 years in these woods, and I knew better than to be caught in the open when something was hunting. "Help me move him," I said, stepping into the cabin. The smell hit me like a physical blow, but I grabbed the dead man's ankles and started dragging him toward the door. Casey stood frozen in the doorway, his expensive rifle shaking in his hands. "Casey," I said, "we don't have a choice." I dragged the corpse outside by its ankles, trying not to breathe through my nose as the smell got worse in the cool evening air. Casey had disappeared around the back of the cabin, and I could hear him puking his guts out between the trees. The dead man was heavier than he looked, waterlogged and bloated from weeks of decay. I pulled him about 50 yards into the forest and left him beside a fallen log, figuring that was far enough to keep the worst of the stench away from our shelter. The carved symbols on his chest caught the fading light, deep cuts that formed patterns I'd never seen before, like someone had taken their time making sure each line was perfect. When I got back to the cabin, Casey was leaning against the wall, his face the color of old snow. "This is insane," he said. "We can't stay here." I looked at the darkening forest around us. The sun had dropped behind the mountains, and shadows were already pooling between the massive trees. "You want to try hiking 5 miles through this terrain in the dark? Be my guest." Casey stared at the tree line like it might swallow him whole. There's got to be another way. There isn't. I stepped back into the cabin and started clearing the worst of the mess. Dark stains covered most of the wooden floor, but I found an old bucket and used water from my pack to scrub away what I could. The weird totems hanging from the ceiling beams swayed in the draft from the open door, animal bones and black feathers tied together with what looked like dried sinew. Casey finally came inside, moving like he expected the walls to collapse on him. What are those things? I glanced up at the bone decorations. Don't know, don't want to know. The cabin was bigger than it looked from outside, with a stone fireplace and shelves built into the log walls. Someone had lived here for a while, judging by the supplies stacked in the corners. Canned food, kerosene lamps, boxes of ammunition for rifles I didn't recognize. Everything covered in dust and mouse droppings. I dragged a heavy wooden table across the floor and wedged it against the door. The thing was solid oak, probably weighed 200 pounds. Casey watched me work, his expensive rifle clutched against his chest like a security blanket. "You think that'll keep something out?" he asked. "Depends what's trying to get in." I checked my rifle, making sure I had a full magazine. 30-06 with soft point bullets, enough to drop anything that walked in Alaska. At least anything I'd ever heard of. Casey found a corner away from where the body had been and slumped down with his back against the wall. His hunting clothes were soaked with sweat, and his hands shook every time he tried to light a cigarette. The cocky businessman from this morning had disappeared completely, replaced by a scared man who was finally understanding that money couldn't buy his way out of every problem. "How long until sunrise?" he asked. I checked my watch. 10 hours. Casey closed his eyes and leaned his head back against the logs. Jesus Christ. I positioned myself by the largest window, where gaps between the boards gave me a view of the clearing outside. The moon was rising through the trees, casting everything in silver light that made the shadows look deeper and more solid than they should. That's when I heard the first footstep. Something big was moving through the forest, walking with a careful, measured pace that didn't sound like any animal I knew. The steps had weight behind them, heavy enough to snap branches and crush undergrowth, but they came with a weird rhythm that made my skin crawl. Casey's eyes snapped open. What was that? I held up my hand for silence and pressed my face closer to the window. Through the gaps in the boards, I could see the moonlit clearing where we'd dragged the body earlier. Nothing moved out there, but the footsteps continued, circling the cabin with patient, deliberate steps. The sound would stop for a few seconds, like whatever was out there had paused to study our shelter, then continue its slow walk around the building. Sometimes the steps sounded like they were on 2 legs, sometimes 4, always accompanied by a low rumbling noise that seemed to vibrate through the cabin walls. Casey gripped his rifle tighter. Is it a bear? I watched a huge shadow move between the trees at the edge of the clearing. Too tall to be a bear, wrong shape entirely. The thing moved upright for several steps, then dropped down and continued on what might have been hands and knees. But the proportions were all wrong. No, I whispered. It's not a bear. The shadow stopped near the cabin, and I could feel something studying us through the walls. Intelligence behind those movements, patience that went way beyond animal instinct. Whatever was out there knew we were trapped inside, and it wasn't in any hurry to do anything about it. The footsteps resumed their circuit around the cabin, and I realized with growing dread that we weren't dealing with some random predator. This thing was smart, careful, and it wasn't afraid of 2 armed men hiding behind wooden walls. Casey started whispering what sounded like prayers, his voice barely audible over the sound of our breathing and the measured footsteps outside. I kept my rifle ready and watched the shadows move between the trees, counting the hours until sunrise and wondering what the hell we'd stumbled into in these ancient woods. I stepped outside the cabin and felt the morning air hit my face like a slap. After 10 hours of breathing that stale, death-soaked atmosphere, even the humid forest air tasted clean. The body was gone. Where we'd left the corpse beside that fallen log, there was nothing but a dark smear across the ground and a trail of disturbed earth leading back into the trees. Something had dragged him away during the night, and from the width of the drag marks, whatever did it was strong enough to pull 200 pounds of dead weight like it was a bag of groceries. I walked around the cabin, checking the perimeter, and felt my stomach drop. Massive footprints covered the soft earth around our shelter, some that looked almost human but stretched nearly 2 feet long, others that might have been animal paws if animals had 6 toes and claws like railroad spikes. But the worst part was the walls. Deep gouges scored the cabin's exterior logs, scratches that started about 8 feet off the ground and ran down to shoulder height. Whatever made them had been tall enough to reach the roof line and strong enough to carve through seasoned wood like it was butter. I traced one of the scratch marks with my finger and realized they weren't random. The gouges formed deliberate patterns, almost like the symbols carved into the dead man's chest. Whoever or whatever had been circling us all night had been leaving messages. Casey stumbled out of the cabin behind me, his expensive hunting clothes wrinkled and stained with sweat. His face had the gray, hollow look of a man who'd spent the night staring at his own mortality. "We're leaving," he said. "Right now." I nodded and headed back inside to gather our gear. Our packs had been scattered across the cabin floor, contents spilled everywhere like something had gone through them with careful, deliberate hands. My spare ammunition was missing, along with most of our food supplies. Casey's expensive GPS unit lay in pieces near the fireplace. "It was in here," Casey whispered, staring at the wreckage. "While we were sleeping, it was inside with us." I checked my rifle and found it exactly where I'd left it, fully loaded and ready. Whatever had searched our gear hadn't been interested in weapons. It wanted something else, though I couldn't figure out what. Casey grabbed what was left of his pack and headed for the door. "I'm not spending another second in this place." I took one last look around the cabin, noting the bone totems still hanging from the ceiling beams and the dark stains we hadn't been able to scrub from the floor. This place had been wrong from the moment we found it, and now I understood why. It wasn't just some abandoned trapper's cabin, it was something else entirely. Something that belonged to forces I'd never imagined in 40 years of wilderness guiding. Outside, Casey was already walking toward the tree line, moving fast despite his exhaustion. I caught up with him at the edge of the clearing and grabbed his arm. "We go straight back to the boat," I said. "No following trails, no stops, no detours. We push hard and get to the water before dark." Casey nodded frantically. "How far?" I checked my compass and calculated the distance. 6 miles if we cut through the forest. 4 hours if we move fast. "And if we don't make it before nightfall?" I looked back at the cabin, where those deep scratch marks caught the morning light. "We make it." I led us into the forest, choosing a direct route toward the coast rather than following the game trails that had brought us here. The trees pressed close around us, massive spruce and hemlock that blocked most of the sunlight and made navigation tricky. But I'd been reading these woods for 4 decades, and I knew how to find water. Casey struggled to keep up, his city-softened condition showing as we climbed over fallen logs and pushed through thick undergrowth. His breathing was already labored after the first mile, but he didn't complain. The cocky businessman who'd strutted down the Ketchikan Pier yesterday morning was gone, replaced by a scared man who finally understood that some problems couldn't be solved with money and attitude. Every few hundred yards, I stopped and listened. The forest around us felt alive with hostile attention, like we were being watched by something that had all the time in the world. Twice I heard branches snapping in the distance, heavy footsteps moving parallel to our path. We weren't alone out here. Whatever had circled our cabin all night was still tracking us, staying just out of sight but close enough to let us know it was there. I kept my rifle ready and pushed Casey harder, knowing that our only chance of survival was reaching the boat before another darkness fell on these ancient woods. I crouched behind the rocks and watched the forest below through my binoculars, scanning the shadows between the massive trees. Nothing moved down there now, but I could feel it waiting. Casey was pressed against the stone beside me, his breathing coming in short gasps. "Is it gone?" I kept the binoculars trained on the spot where I'd seen the thing standing. 8 feet tall, arms hanging past its knees like some nightmare version of a man. The way it had absorbed light instead of reflecting it made my skin crawl. "It's still out there." Casey grabbed my arm. "How do you know?" I lowered the binoculars and checked my GPS. 6 miles to the boat, maybe 4 hours of daylight left. The math wasn't good, but it was what we had. Because I can feel it watching us. I'd spent 40 years learning to read these woods, and right now every instinct I'd developed was screaming that we were prey. The forest felt wrong, like the trees themselves were part of whatever was hunting us. Casey peered over the rocks toward the tree line. "What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know." I shouldered my pack and checked my rifle. "And I don't want to find out." We started down the far side of the ridge, moving as quietly as possible through the thick undergrowth. Casey's expensive boots kept slipping on wet rocks, and his oversized pack caught on every branch, but he'd stopped complaining. Fear had a way of cutting through bullshit real fast. I chose a route that kept us on high ground as much as possible, following deer trails when I could find them. The forest pressed close around us, massive spruce and hemlock blocking most of the sunlight. Every shadow looked like it might be hiding something. About a mile down from the ridge, I heard it again. Heavy footsteps moving through the trees to our left, keeping pace with us but staying out of sight. The thing was smart, patient, like it knew exactly where we were going and wasn't worried about us getting there. I held up my hand, and Casey stopped behind me, breathing hard. We listened for 30 seconds, but the footsteps had stopped too. "It's playing with us," Casey whispered. I nodded and kept walking. The thing could have taken us any time it wanted, probably could have killed us both back at the cabin while we slept. But it hadn't. It was hurting us, driving us towards something, and I didn't like thinking about what that might be. We pushed through a thick stand of Devil's Club, the thorny stems tearing at our clothes. Casey cursed as his pack got tangled in the branches, and I had to help him work it free. The delay cost us 10 minutes we couldn't afford. When we reached the next clearing, I checked my GPS again. 4 miles to go, 3 hours of light left. We were falling behind. "We need to move faster," I told Casey. He looked at me like I'd asked him to fly. "I'm going as fast as I can." I studied his face, seeing the exhaustion and fear there. The cocky businessman from yesterday was completely gone, replaced by a scared man who was finally understanding that money couldn't buy his way out of this. Then we better hope it stays curious instead of hungry. We kept moving, following a game trail that wound between fallen logs and thick patches of salmonberry. The trail was easier walking, but it also made us predictable. Whatever was tracking us would know exactly where we were going. I heard branches snapping behind us, closer this time. The thing was getting bolder as the day wore on. like it knew we were running out of time and options. Casey stumbled over a root and went down hard, his rifle clattering against the rocks. I helped him up, noting the scrapes on his hands and the wild look in his eyes. "How much further?" he asked. I checked the GPS. 3 miles. Casey stared at the dense forest ahead of us, where shadows were already getting longer as the sun dropped toward the mountains. "We're not going to make it, are we?" I shouldered my pack and started walking again. "We're going to make it." But even as I said it, I could hear the thing moving through the trees behind us, no longer bothering to stay hidden. Its footsteps came with a steady rhythm that reminded me of a predator that had finally decided to close the distance on wounded prey. The forest around us felt alive with hostile attention, like we were walking through the territory of something that had been here long before humans ever set foot in Alaska. Something that didn't appreciate visitors. I picked up the pace, pushing Casey harder as we headed down toward the coast. The sound of waves was still hours away, but I could smell salt in the air now. We were getting closer to the water, closer to safety. Behind us, the footsteps kept coming, patient and relentless as the tide. I gunned the motor and felt the inflatable boat slam against the waves as we raced toward our anchored vessel. Casey gripped the sides with white knuckles, his face turned away from the shoreline like he couldn't bear to look back at what we were leaving behind. The howling followed us across the water. That deep, booming sound rolled down from the cliffs and echoed off the inlet walls, getting picked up and answered by voices scattered throughout the forest. I counted at least 6 distinct calls, maybe more, all of them carrying that same inhuman quality that made my teeth ache. Casey finally turned around when we reached our boat, and I saw his face go completely white. The 4 figures still stood at the cliff edge, dark silhouettes against the gray sky. Even from a quarter-mile away, I could see how wrong their proportions were. Too tall, arms hanging too long, heads shaped like nothing that should exist. "Jesus Christ," Casey whispered. "How many of them are there?" I cut the motor and grabbed the ladder hanging from our boat's stern. "Get up there, now." Casey scrambled up the ladder like his life depended on it, which it probably did. I tied off the inflatable and followed him, my hands shaking so bad I could barely work the rope. The howling stopped. That sudden silence felt worse than all the noise, like the forest was holding its breath and waiting for something. I fired up the main engine and threw us into reverse, backing away from the inlet as fast as the boat would move. Casey collapsed onto one of the bench seats, his expensive hunting clothes soaked with sweat and seawater. "Are we safe now?" I looked back at the shoreline, where those 4 shapes had vanished from the cliff edge. The forest looked empty and peaceful, just trees and rocks and normal wilderness. But I knew better now. "We're safe," I said, though I wasn't sure I believed it. I turned us toward open water and pushed the throttle forward, putting distance between us and whatever lived in those woods. The boat cut through the swells, spray flying over the bow as we headed for the shipping channel that would take us back to Ketchikan. Casey didn't say another word during the 2-hour run home. He just sat there staring at his hands, occasionally glancing back toward Prince of Wales Island like he expected to see something following us across the water. I understood the feeling. Every time I checked our wake, part of me expected to see dark shapes moving beneath the surface, keeping pace with our boat. The rational part of my brain knew that was impossible, but rational thinking had taken a beating over the past 24 hours. When we finally reached Ketchikan's harbor, Casey was already pulling cash from his wallet. He counted out my full fee plus a $1,000 tip, handed it over without making eye contact, and walked away down the pier without saying goodbye. I watched him disappear into the crowd of tourists and fishermen, knowing I'd never see him again. Part of me felt bad about that. No guide wants to send a client home traumatized. But another part of me was relieved. Casey would go back to Seattle and his real estate deals, and eventually he'd convince himself that stress and exhaustion had made him imagine things that couldn't possibly exist. I tied up the boat and started unloading our gear, trying to get back to the normal routine of cleaning equipment and checking supplies. But my hands kept shaking, and I found myself looking over my shoulder every few minutes. The harbor felt safe, surrounded by boats and people and the familiar sounds of a working waterfront. But I couldn't shake the memory of that pointing finger, the way the largest creature had marked me personally before letting us leave. I'd been guiding hunters in these waters for 40 years, and I thought I knew every danger the wilderness could throw at me. Bears, weather, equipment failure, client stupidity. I'd dealt with all of it and always brought everyone home safe. But this was different. This was something that had been living in Alaska's deepest forests long before people like me started bringing tourists into their territory. Something that didn't appreciate visitors and had ways of making that clear. I finished loading my truck and drove home to my cabin outside town, but sleep didn't come easy that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw those dark shapes standing on the cliff, watching us leave with intelligence that went way beyond animal instinct. And I couldn't stop thinking about that pointing finger, the way it had singled me out specifically. Like I'd been marked somehow, tagged as someone who'd seen too much and needed to remember the lesson. I never went back to Prince of Wales Island. There were plenty of other places to hunt in southeast Alaska, places where the only things watching you from the tree line were bears and ravens, and other creatures that belonged in the normal world. Some parts of the wilderness demand respect, and some demand to be left alone entirely. After 40 years of thinking, I knew the difference. I'd finally learned there were forces in these ancient forests that were older and stronger than anything human understanding could handle. The smart thing was to stick to familiar territory from now on and let the deep woods keep their secrets. I stared at the water rushing past our hull and tried to make my brain work right again. 2 days ago, I'd been Harold Myers, master of these woods, the guy who knew every trail and every danger between here and Juneau. Now I felt like some tourist who'd wandered into a movie theater halfway through a horror film. Casey hadn't moved from his spot in the cabin since we'd cleared the inlet. He was curled up on the bench seat like a kid hiding from monsters, which I guess wasn't too far from the truth. Every few minutes I'd hear him muttering something about canceling trips or never leaving his condo again. I kept the throttle steady and watched the familiar landmarks slide past. Rocky Point, Seal Bay, the old cannery ruins at Ward Cove. Places I'd been navigating since I was 16 years old. But they looked different now, like someone had moved all the furniture in a room I thought I knew by heart. The forest wasn't just trees and animals anymore. It was something alive, something with guardians that had been protecting secrets since before my grandfather's grandfather ever set foot in Alaska. And I'd spent 40 years stomping around their territory like I owned the place. My hands were still shaking when I tied up at the harbor. Casey climbed out of the boat, moving like an old man, his expensive hunting clothes hanging off him like he'd shrunk inside them. He pulled a wad of cash from his wallet without looking at me. "Here's your fee," he said, counting out bills, plus extra. I took the money and watched him walk toward the parking lot. His custom rifle was still in the boat, that $1,000 piece of equipment he'd been so proud of yesterday morning. I called after him. "Casey, your rifle." He turned around and stared at the gun case like it was full of snakes. "Keep it. Sell it. I don't care." He walked away without another word. I watched him disappear into the crowd of tourists coming off the afternoon ferry.
Just another guy in hunting clothes heading home with stories nobody would believe.
I found myself standing there for 10 minutes, holding his rifle and trying to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. Go home and pretend this never happened. Keep guiding hunters like nothing had changed. Act like I hadn't just learned that everything I thought I knew about these woods was wrong. The rifle felt heavy in my hands. Too heavy. I walked over to the dumpster behind the harbormaster's office and dropped it in with the rest of the garbage. My cabin sat 15 minutes outside town, tucked back in the trees where I could pretend to be a hermit when the tourist season got too crazy. I'd built it myself 20 years ago, every board and nail chosen for function over looks. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, the place where I could decompress after dealing with clients like Casey. But that night, I couldn't stop staring out the windows at the tree line. The woods behind my place had always felt friendly, familiar, as my own backyard. Now they looked different, darker, like they were full of watchers I'd never noticed before. Things that had been keeping track of me for decades while I stumbled around thinking I was the expert. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, trying to read a book about salmon runs. The words wouldn't stick. Every few minutes I'd catch myself looking toward the windows, half expecting to see those tall shadows standing between the spruce trees. Sleep didn't happen. I spent the night in my chair with my rifle across my knees, listening to normal forest sounds that didn't feel normal anymore. Every branch that creaked in the wind made me think of footsteps. Every owl call sounded like something trying to mimic an owl. By morning, I'd made a decision. I was done with the deep wilderness. 40 years of guiding had taught me to trust my instincts, and every instinct I had was screaming that some places were meant to be left alone. I started booking clients closer to town, day trips to spots I could reach by road, places where cell phones worked and help was never more than an hour away. When people asked about multi-day expeditions to Prince of Wales Island or the remote areas up north, I told them I was booked solid. Most of my regular clients didn't question it. Harold Myers had a reputation for safety, and if Harold said a trip wasn't worth the risk, that was good enough for them. The few who pushed for explanations got told about unpredictable weather patterns and increased bear activity in the backcountry. All of it true, technically. Just not the whole truth. 6 months later, my phone rang at 7 in the morning. Alaska State Troopers, asking if I knew anything about an abandoned cabin on Prince of Wales Island. Some hiker had stumbled across it and reported weird symbols carved into trees, animal bones arranged in patterns that didn't look natural. Never seen any cabin in that area, I told the trooper, which was true enough. I'd never seen it before that night, and I sure as hell wasn't planning to see it again. The official report blamed everything on illegal hunting activities, poachers using the cabin as a base camp, probably involved in some kind of ritualistic trophy hunting that got out of hand. The Forest Service went in with chainsaws and bulldozers, erased the whole thing like it never existed. I kept the newspaper clipping in my desk drawer right next to my hunting licenses and insurance papers. Not because I wanted to remember, but because I needed the reminder. Some parts of the wilderness demand respect, and some demand to be left alone entirely. The old forces living in Alaska's deepest forests had been here long before people like me started thinking we could map and manage and guide our way through their territory. They were older and stronger than anything human understanding could handle, and they'd made that clear in terms I couldn't ignore. I was still Harold Myers, still guiding hunters through Southeast Alaska's incredible wilderness. But now, I knew the difference between the woods that welcomed visitors and the places that didn't. And I was smart enough to stick to familiar territory, where the only things watching from the tree line were bears and ravens and other creatures that belonged in the normal world. The deep woods could keep their secrets.
I'd learned enough for one lifetime.